Please be seated. The court is now back in session. I notice the defense counsel is on his feet. What is the subject matter you like to raise? Please provide the chamber with the brief subject matter that you intend to raise, so that we can decide whether we allow you to speak.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Very briefly, I'd like to make a request to admit a new document, or actually to seek some clarification from the chamber on a new document. We're in possession of a new document, new in any sense of the word. It's an article that was published yesterday. It contains some information that we feel is relevant to our case. Specifically, it contains some information we would like to put to Professor Chandler, if that's possible, while he's still with us. I'm seeking your guidance now on the question of whether or not I could be permitted to make a very brief 2-minute oral application, given the time constraints that are placed on us. If I could make that application very quickly, I could circulate a copy of the document to all the parties. They could review it over the night, over the evening. They could make any responses first thing in the morning, and then Your Honors could rule on whether or not we could be allowed to address Professor Chandler on this brand new document, which, as I said, was published yesterday. It's an 11-page document. I don't think anyone would be prejudiced by having a look at it tonight, making some submissions tomorrow morning. I would make the application in 2 minutes, strictly pursuant to Rule 87.4 and your directions on that rule. That's my request.
The President, the new document, is it part of the case file, or is it part of the documents in the list proposed to be submitted before the chamber? Can you identify the source of the documents that you intend to put in your request?
Certainly, Your Honor. It is a brand new document. Brand new in the sense that it's an article that was published yesterday in the New York Review of Books, a very well-known journal, which I think most people in this courtroom are familiar with. It's a new document. It didn't exist 24 hours ago.
The President, I give the floor now to Judge Cartwright to respond to the request by the International Defense Council for Nuon Chea.
Thank you, President. The application must be made in writing pursuant to Rule 87.4, and at least one of the reasons for that is that the article concerned is in one language only, and it would be impossible to make any decision until any such lengthy document has been translated at least into Khmer, so that the entire chamber can discuss it and reach a decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Cartwright, for that ruling. If I may just say, the reason I made the application now is that we could do it orally. The very brief comments I would make would be translated into Khmer for the benefit of everyone.
The President, the Chamber has already ruled on the matter. Let the Judge Cartwright add a little bit further. And of course, you are not allowed to make such a response to the ruling by the Chamber, and I need to administer the proceeding in this courtroom. Of course, you are attentive to make your stance, and we, as the judges of the bench, are trying hard to administer the effective proceeding in this courtroom.
Thank you. I do appreciate that, and I hope it didn't escape anyone's notice. I was trying to be very reasonable. If the request, as it relates to Professor Chandler...
The President, you are not allowed. The floor is again given to the defense team for Kiels and Paul to continue posing questions to the expert. You may proceed. Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, good afternoon, Professor. Before the recess, we discussed the issue of becoming a member of the CPK of Mr. Kieu Sampon, and you confirmed that he became a full right member in 1976, and he actually became a candidate member in 1971. You also stated that you read the closing order of the co-investigating judges, which is a court document stating the dates that you just mentioned. My question to you again is that prior to the issuance of the closing order, prior to you reading the closing order, were you aware of the dates of becoming a member of the CPK by Kieu Sampon, either the candidate membership or the full right membership?
With respect, I'd like to correct your interpretation of my response. Kieu Sampon did not become a candidate member of the CPK in 1971. He became a candidate member of the Central Committee of the CPK in 1971. He became a full rights member of that same Central Committee in 1976. It's inconceivable that a non-member of the Communist Party could be named as a candidate member of the Central Committee. So he must have joined the CPK at least 24 hours before that appointment. Now, I will look, I don't mean to be rude here, but I will look up the date when he joined the CPK. Your statement that that was what I said is not what I said. It refers to the Central Committee, not to his membership in the party, which is still a date that's at issue between us. I mean, not between us, I don't know it, but I'm trying to help you to give you that date. The dates I gave you were Central Committee dates, not CPK dates. And that's how they appear in the closing order. So please don't do that to me, because I don't like to give testimony that way.
Thank you. Let me ask you again. What I heard through the interpretation is that Kisampong became a member of the standing committee of the center of the CPK. Is that your statement, or is it he was the member of the central committee?
No, I'm sorry. If that was a statement in the translation, that certainly was the standing committee meant. What I said is what I was reading from my notes, which I'll have to look at again. So my apologies. The standing committee, of course, is part of the central committee. So if you're a member of one, you're a member. If you're a member of the standing committee, you're also a member of the central committee. The other way doesn't work. Members of the central committee are not necessarily members of the standing committee. Matter of fact, very few members are members of the standing committee.
Thank you very much. I cannot hear it clearly through the interpretation. Could you please try to slow down a little bit more? What you just said is that if a person is a member of the standing committee, that person is automatically a member of the central committee, but it is not another way around. Is that what you just stated?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I'd like you to clarify the date of which you knew that Kisampong was a member of the Central Committee or a candidate member of the Central Committee. When did you learn of that membership?
I can't answer that at this time. What I was told to do was to find out that date. I went and used the materials available in my hotel. I had known it before, but without able to cite a source, I was not able to answer the request. I'd like to see if, I don't remember because I read his autobiography, I'd like to see if Mr. Kisampong mentions this in his autobiography. If he does, he mentioned it in his open statement. He may also have mentioned it in his autobiography. If he did, that's where I read it, because I read that book with care a few years ago. If it's not in that autobiography, then I'd have to look where else I might have heard the information.
Thank you. Based on your statement and that you made before the recess, that is, after having read the closing order you received, I'd like to repeatedly ask you the same question on the date of Mr. Kisampong becoming a member of a candidate, a member or a member of the Central Committee. Is it after your reading of the closing order, or it became, or you were aware of this fact or this assertion prior to you reading the closing order. Mr. Expert, please wait. We hear the objection raised by the prosecution first.
The question has been asked and already answered by the professor, who indicated that he had known that information before.
Counsel. However, I did not hear it in the Khmer channel. And since the professor is here, he can just reiterate the point. It is not a long statement, just a brief statement.
Okay. I apologize. It must have been. I gather from the proceedings that these translations from English into Khmer are being very skillfully done, and I'm sorry that I am too much of a rush occasionally to give them a chance to do a good job, and I'm very grateful to the job they seem to be doing. But one other source that I brought with me, printed 4 years ago, was Solomon Kane, Dictionnaire des Khmer Rouges, a book in French called Dictionary of the Khmer Rouge. In the biographical entry to that journal, he gives these same dates. Now, he doesn't footnote it, so therefore I didn't cite this source. But that's a book that's been in my possession for 4 years, and I wrote the preface to it. So that's an indication that this information was available to me in some form before I read the closing order. What I wanted to do in response to the question that was originally posed by the prosecution was to give a precisely referenced thing for you, and since it came from an open statement, I figured it was a footnote in the closing order that I could cite with confidence. The statement made openly to the court by Khieu Samphan about these dates, and the controversy. I'm sorry, but the controversy eludes me. But maybe there is more of it than I can see.
Read the article about his own biography, can I conclude that you did not study in details regarding the history or the biography of Mr. Khieu Samphan? Is that correct?
With respect, in referring to my previous testimony, that is incorrect. I've told you at least 3 times that I've read with great care his autobiographical book, which I found of a great historical interest. The book, I did not bring his autobiography with me to Phnom Penh. In my collection, my small private collection of books I included the book, it's gotten very well reviewed, Dictionnaire des Khmer Rouges, which has got entries on all sorts of subjects, just to refresh my memory if something came up that I didn't have other sources to cite. This was not the only source I used for Khieu Samphan's biography. I said many times I've read his own autobiography with care and with considerable respect. It's a very interesting document. And your question seems to imply that I just sort of floated in here and read an entry in another book. That's not true, and I've said beforehand it is not true. So I would rather be more productive than this, frankly, as a witness, than just repeating what I've said to you before.
I could not really hear you clearly regarding your long response to my question. I'd just like a brief and precise response whether you study the biography of Mr. Khieu Samphan in detail or not. Because you write very detailed regarding the book entitled Pol Pot Brother Number 1. Is it the same case?
No, I never studied Khieu Samphan's biography with the same attention that I gave to a 3-year writing book project of Pol Pot. But I did not want to give the impression that I'd never studied that biography at length and with interest. And I've said several times, one of the main sources of my information was his own autobiography, and also the introduction to the translation of his very interesting PhD thesis, which I was familiar with since the 1970s. It's been a source of interest to me for a long time, but not, of course, a source of the same prolonged research as my book-length study of Pol Pot.
Thank you. Let me now focus on the structure of democratic Cambodia. Can you tell the bench regarding the structure? If you can, then I can put more questions to you regarding this topic.
I think I'd prefer to wait for your questions because I've discussed in detail in my previous testimony many of the issues involved here. If I were to give a response about the structure of democratic Kampuchea, starting from I don't know which point to what point and taking what point of view, it would be incoherent and would probably take 45 minutes, which we don't have left. So I would like to have, I'd be happy to receive your specific questions if possible.
Thank you. My question to you is the following. What was the highest organization or leadership within the Democratic Cambodia?
That's an excellent question. The highest office in democratic Kampuchea was the chairman of the state. It was the chairmanship of the state presidium, a position held by Mr. Khieu Samphan. As we have learned, I hope, through the last few days, or I hope knew already, really, but as I've testified over the last few days, the top position was not equivalent to any to the person or people who exercised power in democratic Kampuchea. It was the position existed. We know absolutely nothing about what the duties that came with it, but it was, at least in public, and this position appears in public documents, such as the Constitution, radio broadcasts over FBIS, that this position is the highest in the land, and it was the one occupied by your client.
Look, I
Question. You said you based your statement on the Constitution. Can you enlighten us which part of the Constitution would enshrine the highest status of the President of the State Presidium as the highest office in land?
I'd have to have the text of the Constitution up on the screen, but I'm pretty sure that's how this position is designated, as the highest personal position. I think the highest position is when we had this discussion the other day with the National Congress, but I think the highest personal position is the State Presidium, but with the text not in front of me, I'm not going to swear. I know it's in the Constitution, but I don't know the phrasing. I can't know the phrasing.
Thank you. Let I put aside this question. I return to it a bit later. Now my question is in regards to the institutions of democratic Cambodia, namely the Communist Party of Cambodia and the Democratic Cambodia government.
I don't hear a question yet.
Based on your research, what is your assertion that which institution has more power than the other one?
Thank you. Well, certainly from my previous testimony and from a wide number of published sources, it's clear to me that the Communist Party of Democratic Cambodia had more power than the institutions mentioned in the Constitution. Now, the party and the government, once the government is functioning, it's run by party members. So it's party business is government business. But the government, as stated in the Constitution, which somehow suggests that there is some separation of powers, I think partly to satisfy foreign curiosity that Cambodia was not a totalitarian state, DK was not, in other words, I think the separation of powers was implied. There never was such a separation of powers, but if you were to put the offices of the government as stated in the Constitution and the Communist Party of Cambodia as never stated anywhere except perhaps in its statutes, side by side, there's no question that the Communist Party was the only one with any access to power. There were no alternate sources of power in Cambodia in the DK period.
Thank you. So just stated that the Communist Party of Cambodia is the one who hates the power the most. The question is the following: how the CPK utilize their power, or through which medium or institutions that CPK use its power?
I think we've been over this before, but it's a very good question. I think it exercised its power through the standing committee of the Central Committee was the ultimate source of power, but orders were transmitted, suggestions coming up through the pyramidal structure that I mentioned. The activities of the CPK, those activities of the government and the CPK, which the CPK dominated, were performed by various offices that were formed. Some of them are mentioned in the Constitution, some of them not. This is why you have writing sometimes suggesting that people were actually ministers of this or ministers of that. Ieng Sri, for example, was not the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was Vice Prime Minister of Cambodia in charge or with an interest in foreign affairs. I forget the thing. So it doesn't look like a government that is easy to, or no, it isn't a government that's easy to slot into the kinds of governments we have in other countries. A lot of them, the operations are secret. Some of them are ambiguous. Some are overlapping. Some are contradictory. We've had this with what does 870 mean? It means about 8 things all at once. So too, the government there's a lot of overlapping powers, overlapping jurisdictions that makes it very hard to understand.
Council. Thank you very much. With Mr. President's leave, I would like a document that has already been shown time and again, document E3/12, the decision of the Central Committee regarding a number of matters. Could this document be put up on the screen, please? The President, you may proceed. Have you had the hard copy available for Dr. Chandler to review? Council Kung Som-on. Yes, we do. If Dr. Chandler wishes to obtain the copy of the document, the hard copy, we can bring one to him.
That would be easy. I'm looking at the Khmer on the screen, which is helpful, but I just want to make sure my answers are clear about the hard copy in English, if possible.
The President court officer is now instructed to bring the hard copy of the document in English version to the witness. Counsel Gong Sam-on. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like document under ERN 00003142 in Khmer and English ERN 001828 rather 14 to be put up on the screen, please. French ERN 00224367. I would like Professor Chandler to look at point number 2 in the document. Counsel, please, if you have anything to say on this, you may proceed. Indeed, after you have read the document, I would like to proceed with my questions. The questions are as follows. According to your experience, what is your impression concerning the content of this document?
Thanks. I was raising my hand because you mentioned item 2, and there are about 25 item 2s in the paper, so I was waiting, but then you didn't say that, so that's fine. You asked another question. I think, again, I've covered this before, and it's in the transcript, I presume. When Ben Kiernan and I and Chan Tu-bo edited that collection of documents, the reason we put this one first in the book was because it was, I thought, the most, or we all three of us thought, the most revealing. It's an extremely important document in which the leadership of the country is talking to itself about itself. And this is a kind of a dialogue or multilogue that we have very, very few examples of in our archive. And that's the importance of it. I think what is said here is certainly, given the limitations, the limits put on the number of people who were there, pretty much what occurred at this meeting. This is what was said. This is what was decided. Certainly, Paul Plott, the chairman, would have read these minutes, and if there was anything the matter with them from his point of view, he would have sent them back. So I think it's a very important and, from the party's point of view, a very accurate and accurate document. From our point of view, a very revealing one.
Counsel, thank you. For record, I would like to read point number 2. Indeed, I read out the ERN number to you. Perhaps you may have missed it. My apologies for that. On this point, it states that sometime will reserve time, a few days monthly, to meet foreign countries. And this is in point number 3 on page 814 of the document, which which is page 6. So, I'm sure you are aware of this name, Comrade Secretary, which refers to Pol Pot. My question is, had he or did he have more power in the party than in the government? Or what is your position on this?
Again, this is something I've testified to, and I think maybe my answers are getting fuzzier with time, but there's no real difference between what he did for the government. He didn't wake up and say, today I'm working for the government, and in the afternoon I'm working for the party. The two things were just indissoluble. It was not his work for the, I think he felt his work for the party that was not necessarily to be shared with people outside the party was more important than his work for the government, such as meeting foreign visitors or whatever. Those were open things that he did openly. I would, again, this is a suggestion, but just knowing the way this man worked pretty much would have been a lot less important. So, but yeah, I mean, he said reserve time a few days monthly to meet foreign countries. I'm not sure if countries is the right translation, but he certainly never did that. I mean, he never did spend that time, so it looks to me like the second sentence is what operates. He spent all his time working for the party and government, which are the same thing.
Thank you. May I refer you to the document under ERN 0003141 in English? 00182813. And also another page, which is the same, the next page in English, 814. And in French, 00224366. I indeed said that I would come back to the point on the State Presidium, and now I would like to put the question on this. Have you already found the relevant portion I mentioned?
Yes, thank you, I have.
បាទសូមអរគុណចឹងខ្ញុំ
Council, thank you. I would like to ask you the question as follows. Are you familiar with the names of the person in the State the Presidium of State or State Presidium, starting from Comrade Ham, first Deputy Chairman Bang Nut, second Deputy Chairman Comrade Yam? Are you familiar of these names?
Certainly the first two names, Kyusapan and Ben who noticeably does not have the word comrade in front of his name, former Prime Minister under Sihanouk. The last man, Mr. Yim, I would have to check sources to see if I knew exactly who that was. I don't right at this minute know who Comrade Yim was, but with the name, with the word comrade in front of his name, he was a member of the CPK.
Council, thank you. Did you notice why Banot didn't have the code name Comrade before, like the others?
Did you mean, I'm sorry, do you mean Did I notice this before today, or had I known it for a long time? Or did I first discover it today, or I'm missing the exact point of your question.
បាទខ្ញុំចង់សួរថា Counsel, indeed I was asking why, for example, now you see the document, why the term comrade is not seen placed before Fan Nun as it was before other names under the
I think the answer is obvious. This was a holdover from the Sihanouk regime, and he was the only man who, in that document who was not a comrade. And he was not a comrade because he was an outsider. Sihanouk was not a Samachik either. Samachik. And I think they're making that point just decisively in this private document. They weren't going to honor him with any honorary comradeship. They're just talking about him as basically a kind of a other kind of person, not one of them.
Counsel, thank you. Do you know if any of them were member of the standing committee?
Well, I'm sorry. That Kyusampan certainly was. You mean of these three people, Pen Newt had no access to the Communist Party whatsoever. Comrade Nyem, I would have to check that pseudonym. It's not one that springs up right away, but I might be able to come back with that tomorrow, knowing who he is. So I couldn't answer about that third person, whether he was or was not. Kyusampan certainly was, Pen Newt certainly was not. And I think it's of interest that nothing at all is said about the Presidium in this secret document. There's no guidance to how it should behave. Just move right on to other subjects. I think that's significant. Almost as if there is no significance to this position. No power attached to the position, as I was saying before. That's just an imputation, so I don't want to go too far with it.
Some of the Counsel, thank you. I think I may need clarification through interpretation. I heard about the membership of the party, but my question was about the member of the standing committee. Were you referring to the membership of the standing committee or the party?
Gosh, sorry. I know your question was standing committee, and that's to my response. Again, I better slow down because the translator might be missing these points, but certainly it's known in the record. I'm not concealing anything. Comrade Kyusampan was indeed a member of the standing committee. Pen Newt was not a member of anything. The third person I would have to look up to see what that revolutionary name stands for. I may have evidence for that in my room. I don't have it in my head. Sorry if there was that misinterpretation on the, and it's my fault to the translators. I apologize again.
Counsel, thank you. I may have another question concerning the roles or the function of the State Presidium. Do you think you are able to respond to two questions concerning the function, the organization, the structure of the State Presidium?
I can answer to the extent that I know nothing about those subjects. And I would challenge you to say if anybody else does either. not you personally, but I don't think this body has ever had any history, and if it has, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. But I will not be able to answer your question. In other words, I'm sorry. Was that on my last response? I can only listen to one channel at a time. I'm sorry. I wish I could hear all three, but I never said that he was not. I mean, I said that Penut was not. And the third person, I don't know, I'm not sure who he was, so I'm in no position to say whether or not he, Nyum, was on the Standing Committee. I cannot say that. That's what I think I said, and I hope it came through in French and Khmer, but if it didn't, maybe we're in trouble, because that's what I said.
Counsel, apologies. Again, please clarify this for us. You say that Khieu Samphan was the member of the Standing Committee. Is that correct?
Yes.
Counsel, do you think you can support your argument with some documents to prove that he was member of the Standing Committee?
No, look, this is a little embarrassing for me, and I'm sorry for it. I've got back to my original notes. I think that the original question was the membership of the Central Committee, and we've been wandering all over the map with the other memberships. I hope if I was led into this Standing Committee thing, it's because it's 4:15. You haven't led me in with any bad intentions, but I don't want to be, the record I have here, candidate member of Central Committee, and these two different dates that I gave before, those are the documents I can back up. Standing Committee, I can't, and so I'm just not going to do that because I can't do it. It's been Central Committee all along, and if I've misstated, that should be picked up in the record and corrected, because the second statement, my current statement, that he was a candidate member of Central Committee, that's what I copied out of footnote 4435 in the standing order, or the reference that footnote refers to. So, my apologies.
What were the differences in these two institutions' operation?
Again, 10 of 4, might go back to this tomorrow. 10 of 4 is a bit late for that, but I think I've given these points before in earlier testimony. I'm not trying to be evasive. The difference between the two of them primarily is one was very small and one was quite large. And that's all members of the Standing Committee were also members of the Central Committee. As I said before, I think it was one of the earlier questions, the reverse was not true. In other words, obviously, members of the Central Committee, only those few served on both bodies. The Central Committee, I think, numbered about 20 people. I can't quite. These membership is public knowledge. These people were people on the Central Committee were high-ranking party members who had a serious reputation of loyalty. I think, however, we know through history that many of those people were, or several of those people, I guess more than three, were later arrested and killed. But yeah, the Central Committee was perhaps the body that directly under the Standing Committee served it with information and suggestions and received commands and suggestions, which were not. Then they had nothing further to say. Once they'd received these suggestions or commands or what form they took from the Standing Committee, as far as we know, we weren't in these things. This is the way I understand it from other countries, particularly. That was final. The Central Committee couldn't stand up and say, "Oh no, we don't want to do it that way. We want to do it our way." That was not the way it worked. But they were very trusted people who were probably privy to most, if not all, of the Standing Committee decisions. You find these Standing Committee minutes, the handful of them that have survived, there's no distribution to anybody outside the Standing Committee. When you get to some of the other DK documents that have survived, you see fairly wide distribution. So in other words, some of that fairly wide distribution would have gone out of the Standing Committee among members of the Central and possibly even further, down to the zones, military commanders, and so forth. So, but just those two, one was small and in charge, the second was also in charge but obedient and subject to Standing Committee. No. What? Again, I think, this I'd have to go back on this. This is not something I've studied in detail. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but it seems to me that important Central Committee meetings would include the members of the Standing Committee at the meeting. So it's not like they have a chance to talk in a free and easy manner and then go up to Pol Pot and the others and behave differently. I think that though the Standing Committee was there listening to what was being said by a wider group, trying, I think, honestly to pick up information that was not available to them.
Counsel, thank you. I heard in your testimony that the Standing Committee comprised of 20 people. Are you referring to the Standing Committee or the Central Committee?
When you say you heard my testimony, you mean just now? Because in which case we're having some genuine translation problems. 20 members was Standing Committee only. 7 or 8 members is, 20 members is Central Committee only. Standing Committee is smaller, 7 or 8. No, I didn't say that.
The President, thank you. Since it is perhaps the problem in translation, interpreters are advised to be very careful with the terms. The Standing Committee and the Central Committee, the two terms have to be wisely used in order not to mislead parties to the proceeding. And indeed, when Dr. Chandler responses, the terms should be very carefully rendered for him, because the rendition in Khmer indicates that there has been some confusion already in the interpretation when it comes to the Standing Committee and the Central Committee. The two terms are used to interchangeably. For example, when at one point Khieu Samphan was rendered as a member of the standing committee, and on another occasion he was the member of the Central Committee. So we also indeed in the criminal procedures we do not allow parties to put the same question again. Repetitive questions are not allowed because we are afraid that the questions that are put time and again in the same manner may confuse the parties to the proceeding, or may get some different contradictory statements. That's why parties are reminded to be very careful, and we should also remind Dr. Chandler to be rather slow when responding to questions. We hope we can reduce some misunderstanding, and indeed this has some impact on the transcript itself if it continues to happen. Counsel, for Khieu Samphan, you may proceed with 2 more questions before we adjourn for the day. Counsel Kongsamon. Thank you, Mr. President. I have very few questions about the American bombardments. You had been asked by counsel for Mr. Ieng on this, but I would like to know, or we would like to know, the bombs dropped on Cambodian soil during those days. Do you know how much bombs were dropped on Cambodian soil back then?
I don't have the precise number, but it was hundreds of thousands of tons. I'm not trying to diminish the number. The first findings about 1979, the estimates were more than had ever been dropped on Japan. In more recent times, we discussed this in another question that was put to me about the bombings. This figure has gone way up much higher. I mentioned in my response to that question that my problem with those much higher figures was not that they might not be reliable, but they appeared in an unrefereed, unscholarly journal. And that it worried me that the people had chosen to publish these figures in that way. And I waited for something coming from a more, well, not more reliable, but just more referenced source, and none came. But it seems to me quite possible, and I'm not backing away from this, that many more thousands of tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia, and the damage would have been as much greater as one might imagine. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have the exact number of tons. I know it was hundreds of thousands of tons, which is a lot of bombs, more than on Japan. Not more, however, than were dropped on Vietnam. This is more on Japan was a figure that was used to show how shocking this was. But over 10 or 15 years, the Americans have dropped more tonnage on Vietnam, and the question of demoralizing the population of the Vietnamese with these bombings was never brought up by the Vietnamese. So it's just an interesting contrast. They never said, well, you drove us all into the whatever. But that's you can skip all that. That's extra. I'm sorry. It was a horrible incident. As I think I said, a horrible series of events. Hundreds of thousands of tons.
President, thank you, Council, and thank you very much, Mr. Expert. The time is now appropriate for the adjournment for today's proceeding. The court will now adjourn and resume tomorrow morning, that is Wednesday, the 25th of July 2012, commencing from 9 a.m. And we will continue to hear the testimony of Professor David Chandler, questioned by Khieu Samphan's defense. Professor David Chandler, the hearing of your testimony has not yet concluded, and we require to hear your testimony again tomorrow, and it might take one whole morning session. Court officer, could you assist the expert in cooperation with the visual for his returning to his place of residence and having returned to the courtroom tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Security guards are instructed to take the three accused back to the detention facility and have them back in the courtroom tomorrow morning before 9 a.m. As for Mr. Ieng Sari, if he shows his clear stance regarding his direct presence in the courtroom with the letter of waiver through his defense counsel prior to the commencement of hearing, then you need to liaise that information with the judge and have it brought to the holding cell downstairs with the facility of audio-visual means for him to follow the proceeding, and we will decide on his request accordingly prior to the commencement of the hearing of the expert. The court is now adjourned.